Sometimes the hardest thing about growing old isn't saying goodbye to who you were, but facing who you failed to become. When you've spent decades running from your mistakes, the last thing you expect is for them to be waiting in the place you thought would finally give you peace. Granger bought a rundown cabin in the Colorado mountains for next to nothing. The previous owner had died alone, leaving behind rooms packed with old junk. Bo figured he'd clean it out and live quietly, but as he started moving things around, he noticed the clutter wasn't random. It was arranged like a trail leading somewhere. When he followed it and found what was hidden beneath the floorboards, it changed everything about his past. What had been waiting 40 years for him to find it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine trees like old memories refusing to let go. Granger stood on the sagging porch of his new home, coffee steam rising from his chipped enamel mug, watching the sun paint the Rocky Mountain peaks in shades of gold and amber. At 68, he'd finally found what he'd been searching for his entire adult life, a place where the nearest neighbor was 10 miles away, and the only sounds were wind through branches and water over stone. The cabin sat in a natural clearing at 8,000 feet, surrounded by towering ponderosa pines and Douglas firs that had been growing since before his grandfather was born. A small creek meandered past the property, its voice a constant whisper that spoke of seasons and centuries. The structure itself was modest: 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living area with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. Built sometime in the 1940s, it showed its age in the warped floorboards, the windows that stuck in their frames, and the roof that would need attention before the next heavy snow. Bo had paid cash for the place, $14,000 for the cabin, and 40 acres of mountainside that nobody else wanted. The real estate agent, a young woman with city manners and nervous energy, had tried to talk him out of it. The access road was barely passable, she'd warned. No cell phone service. The nearest town was 30 miles of winding mountain highway. The previous owner, an old hermit named Walter Quincy, had died the winter before, found frozen in his chair 3 weeks after his heart gave out. Perfect, Bo had said, signing the papers without a second thought. He'd spent 68 years learning that people were more trouble than they were worth. 3 failed marriages, each ending when the woman realized that Bo Granger was better suited to wilderness than civilization. Countless jobs that ended when his wanderlust overtook his need for steady pay. A daughter in Oregon who sent Christmas cards but never called. A son in Texas who'd stopped speaking to him 20 years ago over words that couldn't be taken back. The mountains didn't judge. They didn't ask why a man chose solitude over companionship, or demand explanations for the choices that led him to buy a dead man's cabin with the last of his savings. The peaks simply stood patient and eternal, offering the kind of peace that came only when you stopped trying to fix things that were better left broken. Bo's hands wrapped around the coffee mug were weathered from decades of outdoor work, trapping, guiding construction when times were lean. Deep lines mapped his palms, like the topographic maps he'd used to navigate these same mountains in his younger days. His face bore similar geography: crow's feet from squinting into sun and snow, furrows across his forehead from worry and weather, a scar along his jawline from a grisly encounter he'd been lucky to survive. His hair had gone completely gray, though it remained thick and unruly despite his attempts to keep it trimmed. His body still carried the lean strength of a man who'd spent his life using his muscles, though his joints complained more than they used to, especially in the cold. He moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned that wasted motion could mean the difference between warmth and freezing, between eating and going hungry. The cabin's interior told the story of a man who'd lived alone for too long. Walter Quincy had been a collector, or perhaps a hoarder. Every surface held something: mason jars filled with bent nails and rusted screws, coffee cans stuffed with wire and string, cardboard boxes containing everything from old magazines to broken tools. The kitchen counters were stacked with dishes that hadn't been used in years. The living room was a maze of furniture draped with moth-eaten blankets and newspapers dating back to the Reagan administration. Bo had been working through the clutter for 3 days now, filling trash bags and organizing salvageable items into neat piles on the porch. Some of it was genuinely useful: cast-iron cookware, hand tools, oil lamps that would serve when the generator failed. Most of it was the accumulated debris of a life lived without company, where throwing things away felt like discarding parts of yourself. But there was something odd about the way things were arranged. At first, Bo had assumed it was the random accumulation of a lonely old man. But as he worked, he began to notice patterns. A broken wagon wheel, leaning against the north wall of the living room, pointed toward a stack of wooden crates. The crates were positioned to direct attention toward an old trunk pushed against the far corner. The trunk's position seemed deliberate, angled to face a bookshelf that held more knickknacks than books. It reminded Bo of the trail signs he'd learned as a young man, subtle markers that guided travelers without announcing their presence to casual observers. Rock cairns that pointed toward water sources, broken branches arranged to indicate safe passage. The kind of communication that spoke only to those who knew how to read the language. Yesterday, while organizing the bookshelf, he'd found the photograph. It was tucked inside a water-stained copy of Robinson Crusoe, pressed between pages that told of isolation and survival. The image was faded, the edges soft with age, but the face was unmistakable. Violet Morrison, exactly as she'd looked 40 years ago, when Bo had been young and stupid and convinced that the world held nothing but possibilities. She was sitting on a porch swing, her dark hair catching sunlight, wearing a yellow dress that brought out the green in her eyes. Her smile was the same one that had made Bo's chest tight with feelings he hadn't known how to handle at 28. Behind her, barely visible in the photograph's background, was the corner of a cabin that looked remarkably similar to the one where Bo now stood. The discovery had hit him like a punch to the solar plexus. He'd sat on Walter's dusty couch, holding the photograph with shaking hands, trying to understand how a picture of his lost love had ended up in a dead hermit's book collection. Violet Morrison, who he'd abandoned in Durango when the weight of her expectations became more than his restless spirit could bear. Violet, who talked about marriage and children and building something permanent while Bo dreamed of mountain peaks he hadn't climbed and valleys he hadn't explored. He'd told himself he was saving her from a life of disappointment. Men like him weren't meant for white picket fences and Sunday dinners with relatives. He was a wanderer, a seeker, someone who needed the freedom to follow his impulses wherever they led. Settling down would have slowly killed everything wild and honest about him. At least, that's what he'd told himself during the long nights when whiskey couldn't quite drown out the memory of her tears. Now, holding her photograph in a stranger's cabin, Bo wondered if he'd been running from something entirely different. Not from commitment, but from the fear that he wasn't worthy of the love she'd offered. That a woman like Violet Morrison, educated, refined, full of dreams and plans, deserved better than a rough mountain man who measured his worth in the animals he could track and the storms he could survive. The photograph had no writing on the back, no date or explanation, just Violet's face, frozen in a moment of happiness that felt like an accusation across 4 decades of separation. Bo had tried to remember if he'd ever seen this particular image before, but his memories of their time together had blurred into a collection of sensations. Her laugh, the way she fit against his shoulder, the scent of her hair when she leaned close to point out constellations in the night sky. He'd spent the evening walking the property, trying to shake off the strange feeling that the cabin was trying to tell him something. The photograph felt like the first word of a sentence he couldn't yet understand. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, he'd built a fire in the stone fireplace and sat in Walter's old recliner, staring at the flames and wondering what other surprises waited in the accumulated debris of the hermit's life. The morning brought clarity of a sort. Whatever message Walter Quincy had left behind, Bo would find it by following the trail of carefully placed objects. The old man had been trying to communicate something, and the photograph was just the beginning. Bo finished his coffee and set the mug on the porch railing. Time to see where the breadcrumbs led. Inside, he approached the bookshelf with new purpose. If the photograph was a starting point, then the books themselves might hold additional clues. He pulled each volume from its place, shaking it carefully and examining the pages for hidden items. Most revealed nothing but dust and the occasional pressed flower. But the third book from the left, a collection of Robert Frost poems, felt heavier than it should. The pages had been carefully hollowed out, creating a small compartment that held a tarnished brass key. The key was old but well-maintained, its teeth worn smooth from use. It bore no markings or identifying information, but its size and shape suggested it belonged to something substantial, perhaps a chest or strongbox, rather than a simple door. Bo held the key up to the morning light, streaming through the cabin's dusty windows. Somewhere in this maze of accumulated possessions was the lock this key would open, and based on the care with which it had been hidden, whatever lay behind that lock was important enough to guard with an elaborate trail of clues. The hunt was beginning in earnest. The key led Bo on a methodical search through Walter's accumulated treasures. He moved with the patience of a man who'd spent decades tracking elusive prey, examining each piece of furniture and every container that might accept the brass key's embrace. The morning stretched into afternoon as he worked his way through the cabin room by room. In the bedroom, he found nothing but clothing that smelled of mothballs and loneliness. The kitchen yielded only the standard collection of a bachelor's necessities: canned goods, mismatched plates, and a coffee pot that had seen better decades. But in the living room, beneath a stack of old National Geographic magazines, Bo discovered what he was looking for. The trunk was solid oak, darkened with age, and built to last generations. Its brass corners had tarnished to the color of old pennies, and the lock mechanism was substantial enough to resist casual tampering. Bo knelt beside it, his knees protesting against the hard floor, and slid the key into place. It turned with surprising smoothness, the tumblers falling into alignment with a soft click that seemed to echo through the quiet cabin. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture and time, lay a leather-bound journal. The cover was deep brown, worn smooth by countless hands, and secured with a leather cord that had been tied and retied so many times it had formed permanent creases. Bo lifted it with the reverence of a man handling something sacred, recognizing immediately that this was no casual diary, but a record of someone's deepest thoughts. The leather cord yielded to his careful fingers, and the journal fell open to reveal pages filled with feminine handwriting in faded blue ink. The script was elegant, each letter formed with the precision of someone who'd been taught that penmanship reflected character. At the top of the first page, in slightly larger letters, was written, "The private thoughts of Violet Morrison begun this day, April 15th, 1983. Bo's heart hammered against his ribs, as if he'd been climbing at altitude. 40 years ago, the timing aligned perfectly with the period, just after he'd left Durango, when Violet would have been trying to rebuild her life from the pieces he'd left scattered in his wake. His hands trembled as he turned to the first entry. "He's been gone 3 weeks now, and I still find myself listening for his truck in the driveway. The silence in this house feels different than it did before I knew him, heavier somehow, as if the air itself remembers his presence. I tell myself I'm better off without a man who couldn't see past his own restless nature, but my heart doesn't seem to understand logic." The words hit Bo like physical blows. He could hear Violet's voice in every sentence, remember the thoughtful way she spoke when wrestling with complex emotions. He forced himself to continue reading, though each line felt like penance for sins he'd tried to forget. "Mother says I'm lucky to discover his true nature before making any permanent commitments. But she doesn't understand the whole truth. I haven't told anyone yet, I'm not even certain myself, but I think I might be carrying his child. It's too early to be sure, but my body feels different, and I've missed my monthly cycle. If it's true, I'll raise this baby alone rather than use it to chain a man who clearly values his freedom more than love. The journal slipped from Beau's nerveless fingers, landing on the floor with a soft thud that seemed to shake the foundations of everything he thought he knew about his past. A child. Violet had been pregnant when he'd run away to chase dreams that had turned to dust in his hands. Somewhere in the world, he might have a son or daughter who'd grown up believing their father had abandoned them before they were even born. Beau's vision blurred as he struggled to process the magnitude of what he'd learned. All those years of telling himself he'd made the right choice, that he'd saved Violet from a life of disappointment with an unreliable man. All those decades of justifying his decision as an act of mercy rather than cowardice. And she'd been carrying his child when he'd driven away without looking back. He retrieved the journal with shaking hands and forced himself to continue reading. The next several entries documented Violet's growing certainty about her pregnancy and her determination to build a life for herself and her unborn child. Her words revealed a strength Beau had always admired, but never fully appreciated: the ability to face difficult circumstances. With grace and practical resolve, I've decided to keep the baby and raise it here in Durango. Mrs. Patterson has offered me work at her dress shop, and I've saved enough money to get by for the first few months. I won't pretend this will be easy, but many women have faced worse circumstances with less support. At least I have my health and my education, and a town full of people who care about my welfare. The entries continued through the spring and summer of 1983, chronicling Violet's pregnancy and her preparations for single motherhood. Beau read with growing amazement at her courage and growing self-loathing at his own blindness. She'd written about morning sickness and swollen ankles, about choosing names and preparing a nursery in the small house they'd briefly shared. Through it all, her tone remained hopeful despite the occasional moment of loneliness or fear. Then came the entry that stopped Beau's heart completely. Thomas Walter Morrison was born this morning at 6:47 a.m., weighing 7 pounds and 3 ounces. The doctor says he's perfectly healthy, with his father's strong lungs, and I hope his mother's common sense. He has Beau's dark hair and what I suspect will become Beau's stubborn chin. I've decided to give him Walter as a middle name after my father, but I can't help wondering if his real father would be proud to see this beautiful boy who carries half his blood. Thomas Walter. Beau's son, a son he'd never known existed, carried the same middle name as the hermit whose cabin now belonged to Beau. The coincidence felt too perfect to be accidental, but Beau's mind couldn't yet grasp the implications. He read on, desperate to understand how Violet's journal had ended up in Walter Quincy's possession. The subsequent entries painted a picture of a devoted mother raising a bright, energetic child who seemed to inherit the best qualities of both parents. Thomas was curious about the natural world, drawn to the mountains that surrounded their town, and possessed of an independent spirit that reminded Violet constantly of his absent father. She wrote about his first words, his first steps, and his endless questions about why he didn't have a daddy like the other children. Thomas asked again today why his father doesn't live with us. I've been telling him that some daddies travel for work and can't come home very often, but he's getting old enough to notice that other children's fathers visit for birthdays and holidays. How do I explain that his father doesn't even know he exists? How do I tell a 4-year-old that some people run away from love because they're afraid of what it might cost them? Beau had to stop reading and step outside for air. The cabin felt suffocating, the weight of revelation pressing down on him like the atmosphere before a mountain storm. He stood on the porch, gulping the thin air and trying to steady his racing thoughts. 40 years. For 40 years, he'd had a son walking the earth, and he'd never known. All those empty years when he'd convinced himself that solitude was freedom, when he'd measured his worth by how little he needed from other people. What kind of man had Thomas become? Was he still alive? Did he know his father's name? Or had Violet protected Beau's identity to spare them both the pain of a reunion that might bring more hurt than healing? The journal might hold those answers, but Bo wasn't certain he had the courage to keep reading. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the clearing when Bo finally returned to the trunk. Whatever else lay in those pages, he owed it to his son, to Thomas, to learn the whole truth. He'd run away from responsibility once before, leaving others to bear the consequences of his choices. He wouldn't compound that failure by running away from the truth now, no matter how much it hurt to face. The journal held more secrets, he was certain. The carefully orchestrated trail that had led him to this moment suggested that Walter Quincy had known exactly who would eventually buy his cabin. Somehow, the hermit had engineered Bo's return to face the past he'd spent 40 years trying to forget. Bo spent the night wrestling with demons he'd thought were long buried. Sleep came in fragments between waves of regret that crashed over him like mountain avalanches. When dawn finally broke through the cabin's grimy windows, he found himself still sitting in Walter's recliner, the journal open on his lap to pages he'd read and reread until the words burned themselves into his memory. The morning light revealed something he'd missed in his emotional turmoil the night before. Tucked between the journal's final pages was a small object wrapped in tissue paper. Bo unwrapped it with careful fingers, revealing a hand-carved wooden horse no bigger than his palm. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every detail of mane and muscle rendered with the love of someone who understood both wood and the creature it represented. On the horse's belly, carved in tiny letters, were the initials TWM, Thomas Walter Morrison, his son's toy, carved by hands that had loved the boy enough to spend hours perfecting each curve and line. Bo turned the horse over and found more carving on the base. "For my brave little cowboy. With all my love, Mama." The toy felt warm in Bo's weathered hands, as if it still held some essence of the child who'd played with it decades ago. He could picture Thomas at 4 or 5 years old, galloping the wooden horse across kitchen tables and bedroom floors, lost in adventures that took him to places his real father should have been there to explore with him. The weight of that loss settled on Bo's shoulders like the pack he'd carried through countless mountain expeditions. Familiar, heavy, and impossible to set aside. He returned to the journal, turning to entries from Thomas's 5th year. Violet's handwriting had grown more confident over time, her words revealing the strength she'd developed as a single mother navigating the challenges of raising a spirited boy. Her love for their son shone through every sentence. But Bo could read between the lines to see the exhaustion, the moments of doubt, the weight of carrying responsibilities that should have been shared. Thomas has been asking more questions about his father lately. Yesterday, he wanted to know if his daddy was a cowboy or a soldier or maybe a mountain climber. I told him his father was someone who loved the outdoors and wasn't afraid of wild places. It's not exactly a lie, but it's not the whole truth either. How do I explain that his father chose the wilderness over us? How do I make a 5-year-old understand that some people love their freedom more than they love anything else? The words cut deep because they held more truth than Bo had ever wanted to acknowledge. He had chosen freedom over responsibility, adventure over commitment. He told himself it was noble, that he was saving Violet from a life of uncertainty and disappointment. But reading her words now, he could see his choice for what it really was, cowardice dressed up as sacrifice. As Thomas grew older, the entries revealed a boy who seemed determined to bridge the gap his father's absence had created. He excelled in school, helped neighbors with chores, and showed a natural aptitude for understanding the mountain environment that surrounded their town. Violet wrote about his fascination with tracking animals, his ability to read weather patterns, and his uncanny sense of direction in the wilderness, all traits that made Bo's chest tight with recognition. Mrs. Henderson commented today that Thomas has his father's way with the outdoors. She didn't mean anything by it, but it reminded me how much of Bo I see in our son. The way he studies animal tracks in the mud, the patience he shows when waiting for deer to come to the creek behind our house, even the way he tilts his head when he's listening to sounds in the forest. Sometimes I wonder if there's some genetic memory that connects him to a man he's never met. Bo set the journal aside and walked to the window, staring out at the peaks that had called to him his entire adult life. Those same mountains had apparently called to his son as well, drawing Thomas into the wilderness despite having no father to teach him its ways. The irony was almost too painful to bear. His boy had inherited the very wanderlust that had driven Bo away from home and family. The journal entries continued through Thomas's childhood and into his teenage years. Violet documented her son's growing independence, his summer jobs working for local ranchers, and his plans to join the military after high school graduation. With each page, Bo watched his son grow into a man through his mother's loving but worried observations. Thomas has decided to enlist in the army after graduation. He says he wants to serve his country and see something of the world beyond Colorado's borders. I can't help but hear echoes of his father in those words, the same restless spirit that took Bo away from us. I'm proud of Thomas's desire to serve, but terrified that the wandering blood he inherited will take him to places from which he might not return. The final entries in the journal were dated from the late 1990s, when Thomas would have been in his teens. Violet's handwriting had grown shakier with age, but her devotion to documenting their life together remained constant. She wrote about Thomas's graduation from high school, his decision to join the Army Rangers, and her own failing health that made her increasingly dependent on her son's care when he was home on leave. Thomas ships out for advanced training next month. He's grown into such a fine young man, strong, honorable, and kind, in ways that would make his father proud if Bo could see him now. Sometimes I catch Thomas staring at the mountains with an expression I remember from his father's face, and I know that the call of wild places lives in his blood. I only pray that his adventures bring him home safely to the people who love him. The journal ended abruptly with that entry, leaving Bo with more questions than answers. What had happened to Thomas after he joined the army? Where was he now, and did he even know his father's name? The wooden horse felt heavier in Bo's hands as he contemplated the years of his son's life that he'd missed. First words, first steps, school plays, graduation, perhaps marriage and children of his own. Bo wrapped the toy carefully in its tissue paper and placed it back in the journal. Whatever trail Walter Quincy had laid for him to follow, it clearly didn't end with Violet's diary. The old hermit had known about Thomas, about the connection between the boy and the man who'd bought his cabin. The question was why Walter had cared enough to preserve these memories and ensure they found their way back to Bo. Standing in the afternoon light that slanted through the cabin's windows, Bo made a decision that felt like the first honest choice he'd made in 40 years. He would find out what had happened to his son. He would follow the trail of clues that Walter had left, no matter where it led or what painful truths it revealed. Thomas deserved a father who was willing to face the consequences of his choices, even if that father was 40 years too late to matter. The wooden horse had shown him the way forward. Now he had to find the courage to take the next step. The drive to Pine Ridge took Bo through winding mountain roads that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with Colorado's high country in the first place. The town sat in a valley between two massive ridges, its main street lined with the kind of businesses that served ranchers, hunters, and the occasional tourist brave enough to venture this far from the interstate. Bo parked his battered pickup outside the county courthouse, a brick building that had weathered nearly a century of mountain winters. Inside, the clerk was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and the efficient manner of someone who'd been answering the same questions for decades. She looked up from her paperwork as Bo approached the counter, her eyes taking in his worn clothing and weathered appearance with the practiced assessment of someone who knew the difference between a local and a drifter. "Help you with something?" "I'm looking for information about a property I just bought," Bo said, pulling a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "Trying to understand its history, maybe find out about previous owners." The clerk examined the deed Bo handed her, her expression shifting from polite interest to something more guarded. "The old Quincy place. That property's got quite a history attached to it. You sure you want to dig into all that?" Seems like I need to, Bo replied. The things I found in the cabin suggest there's more to the story than what's written on the deed. The woman studied Bo's face for a long moment, apparently deciding he could handle whatever she might tell him. Walter Quincy lived up there for 30 years, but the land goes back further than that. Used to belong to the Morrison family, good people who ran cattle up in those meadows. That was before the trouble started. Bo's pulse quickened at the familiar name. Morrison? What kind of trouble? The kind that comes when outside interests start sniffing around valuable property. The clerk lowered her voice, glancing around the empty office as if old secrets still had ears. Back in the 80s, some mining company out of Denver started making noise about mineral rights up that way. Claimed they had legal basis to survey the land, maybe do some exploratory drilling. She pulled out a thick folder from beneath the counter, its manila surface worn soft from handling. The Morrison family fought it, said their deed was clear, and the mining company was trying to steal land that had been in their family for 3 generations. Things got ugly fast when lawyers got involved. Bo opened the folder to find copies of legal documents, newspaper clippings and survey maps marked with red ink that traced property boundaries and potential mineral deposits. The maps showed Bo's current property as part of a larger tract that had once belonged to someone named David Morrison. Violet's father, most likely, which meant Thomas had a legitimate claim to the land Bo had just purchased. What happened to the Morrison family? Bo asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. David Morrison died in what the sheriff called a hunting accident, the clerk said quietly. Shot by someone who apparently mistook him for an elk, though David had been hunting those mountains for 40 years and never had trouble before. His daughter inherited the property, but she couldn't afford to fight the mining company's lawyers on her own. The clerk pointed to a newspaper, clipping dated November 1985. The headline read, "Local rancher dies in hunting. Mishap." Below was a photograph of a man in his 50s with kind eyes and Violet's stubborn chin. David Morrison, Bo's son's grandfather, killed in what sounded suspiciously like murder disguised as accident. The daughter sold to Walter Quincy for a fraction of what the land was worth. The clerk continued. Poor girl was overwhelmed, single mother with a young boy, no family left to help her fight. Walter paid her enough to relocate somewhere safe, and he agreed to keep the mining company from getting their hands on the property. Bo's hands tightened on the folder as the pieces began falling into place. Violet had been forced to sell her family's land and leave Colorado, taking Thomas with her to escape the same people who'd killed her father. Walter Quincy hadn't been just a hermit living alone in the mountains. He'd been a guardian, protecting land that rightfully belonged to Bo's son. Did you know Walter personally? Bo asked. Well enough, the clerk replied. He'd come to town maybe once a month for supplies, always paid his taxes on time, never caused trouble. But he was protective of that property in ways that went beyond normal ownership, like he was holding it in trust for someone. The mining company ever give up their claim? The woman's laugh held no humor. Hartman Industries. Those people don't give up on anything worth money. They've been quiet the last few years, but word is they're still interested in the mineral rights up there. Walter's death probably has them circling again, wondering who bought the property and whether the new owner might be more willing to deal. Bo studied the survey maps more carefully, noting the detailed geological annotations that marked potential copper and silver deposits throughout the area. The land he'd bought for its isolation and peace was apparently sitting on top of enough valuable minerals to make his property worth millions to the right. Buyer, what can you tell me about the Morrison girl and her son? Bo asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Violet was a sweet girl, smart as a whip, and determined to give that boy of hers a good life despite everything that happened. The son, Thomas, I think his name was, grew up to be quite a young man. Joined the military after high school, became some kind of special forces soldier. Made his mother proud. The clerk's expression grew somber. Of course, that was before the accident overseas. Violet never really recovered from losing him. Some say that's what finally broke her health, though officially she died of cancer a few years back. The words hit Bo like a physical blow. Thomas was dead. His son, the boy he'd never known, whose childhood he'd missed, whose wooden horse he'd held in his trembling hands, was gone. All the plans Bo had been forming, the desperate hope that he might somehow make amends for 40 years of absence, crumbled into dust. "You all right?" the clerk asked, noticing Bo's sudden pallor. "Fine," Bo managed, though he felt anything but fine. Just trying to understand the whole situation. He gathered the documents and thanked the clerk, walking back to his truck on unsteady legs. The mountain air felt thin and inadequate as he sat behind the wheel, staring at the peaks that had once promised freedom, but now felt like monuments to his failures. Thomas was dead. Violet was dead, and Bo was left alone with the weight of choices that could never be undone. But Walter Quincy had still arranged for the property to find its way to Bo, still left clues pointing toward truths that needed to be uncovered. There had to be more to the story than what the clerk had told him. The trail wasn't over yet. Bo returned to the cabin as the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded him of autumn aspens. The beauty felt like mockery now. The mountain's eternal presence, a reminder of how brief and fragile human lives were in comparison. His son was dead, buried in some military cemetery, thousands of miles from the Colorado high country that had shaped his character. Inside Walter's trunk, beneath the journal and wrapped in a piece of old canvas, Bo found what he was looking for next. The items were carefully preserved. A folded American flag in a presentation case, a Bronze Star Medal, and a military service record that told the story of Thomas Walter Morrison's brief but distinguished career. The flag was the kind presented to families at military funerals, folded into the precise triangle that honored fallen soldiers. Bo held it with the reverence due to something sacred, understanding that this represented not just his son's service, but his sacrifice. The weight of it seemed to encompass all the conversations they'd never had, all the fishing trips and hunting expeditions that might have been. The Bronze Star citation was typed on official Army letterhead, dated 3 years earlier. Technical Sergeant Thomas W. Morrison had been killed while attempting to rescue wounded comrades during a firefight in Afghanistan. The dry military language couldn't capture the courage it must have taken for Thomas to risk his life for fellow soldiers. But it confirmed what Bo had somehow known. His son had grown into the kind of man who put others before himself. The service record painted a picture of a soldier who'd excelled at everything the Army asked of him. Thomas had completed Ranger training, served multiple deployments, and earned commendations for leadership and valor. His specialty had been mountain warfare and survival training, skills that reflected his Colorado upbringing and the outdoor instincts he'd inherited from a father he'd never known. Bo spread the documents across Walter's kitchen table, studying them by lamplight as the cabin settled into evening quiet. Thomas had been 29 when he died, barely older than Bo had been when he'd abandoned Violet and fled to the mountains. But where Bo had used his wilderness skills to avoid responsibility, Thomas had channeled those same abilities into service and sacrifice. The most devastating item was a letter tucked inside the service record, written in Thomas's own hand. It was addressed to his mother but never sent, found among his personal effects after his death. The handwriting was bold and confident, like his mother's, but with masculine angles that reminded Bo uncomfortably of his own penmanship. "Dear Mom," the letter began, "I know you worry about me being over here, but I want you to know that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The mountains taught me that some things are worth protecting, worth fighting for, even when the cost is high. You gave me that lesson without ever realizing it, raising me to understand that real strength comes from standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves." Bo had to stop reading and step outside for air. His chest felt tight, as if the altitude was finally getting to him after all these years of mountain living. He stood on the porch, gripping the railing and trying to process the magnitude of what he'd lost. Not just a son, but a good man whose life had mattered in ways Bo's never had. When he returned to the letter, The words cut even deeper. Sometimes I wonder about my father, whether he was the kind of man who would understand why I chose this path. You've always been careful not to speak ill of him, but I know he left us when things got difficult. I've decided that maybe his weakness became my strength somehow. Maybe his abandonment taught me never to abandon the people counting on me. The letter went on to describe Thomas's hopes for returning home, his plans to use his GI Bill benefits for college, and his dreams of becoming a park ranger in the Colorado wilderness. He wanted to protect the land that had shaped him, to ensure that future generations could experience the same connection to the natural world that had guided his life. I've been thinking about the old Morrison property that Grandpa lost before I was born. Thomas wrote, "Someday I'd like to find a way to get it back, to honor his memory and maybe build something lasting there. I know it's probably just a dream, but the thought of returning to those mountains keeps me going during the hard days over here." Bo folded the letter with shaking hands, understanding now why Walter Quincy had been so protective of the land. The old hermit had known about Thomas's dream, had somehow acquired the property not for himself, but to hold it in trust until the rightful heir could claim it. But Thomas had died before that reunion could happen, leaving Walter to find another way to honor the young soldier's memory. The trail of clues made perfect sense now. Walter had arranged for the property to find its way to Bo, not out of kindness to a stranger, but as a final gift to Thomas. The son would never be able to reclaim his grandfather's land, but perhaps his father could be trusted to protect it in his memory. Bo spent the night reading and rereading every document in the trunk, trying to piece together the full story of his son's life. There were photographs from Thomas's military service, a young man in camouflage who had Violet's eyes and Bo's stubborn jawline, letters from fellow soldiers who'd served with him, all speaking of his courage, his loyalty, and his unwavering dedication to his mission. One letter from Thomas's commanding officer provided details about his death that the official citation had omitted. Thomas had volunteered for a dangerous rescue mission when his unit came under heavy fire. He'd successfully evacuated 3 wounded soldiers before returning for a 4th who was trapped in the kill zone. An enemy sniper had cut him down just meters from safety, but his sacrifice had saved 4 lives. Sergeant Morrison died as he lived, the officer wrote, putting others before himself and never backing down from a fight worth fighting. He spoke often of the Colorado mountains and his hope of returning there someday. In lieu of flowers, his mother has asked that donations be made to a fund for preserving wilderness areas in his memory. Bo closed his eyes and leaned back in Walter's recliner, overwhelmed by grief for a son he'd never known and pride for the man Thomas had become without his guidance. Violet had raised their boy to be everything Bo had failed to be, honorable, selfless, and committed to something larger than his own desires. The wooden horse sat on the table beside the military documents, a child's toy that had somehow bridged 40 years and connected Bo to the legacy he'd nearly missed entirely. Thomas was gone, but his dream of protecting the family land lived on. Bo might be 40 years too late to be the father his son had deserved, but he could still honor Thomas's memory by ensuring the Morrison property remained safe from those who would exploit it. The fight that had killed David Morrison and driven Violet from her home wasn't over. Hodman Industries was still circling, still looking for a way to claim the mineral rights that could make them millions. But they were about to discover that the new owner of the Morrison land was a man with nothing left to lose and finally something worth fighting for. His son's dream would not die with him. The morning brought visitors Bo hadn't expected. He was splitting kindling on the front porch when he heard the rumble of expensive engines making their way up the rough mountain road. 2 black SUVs emerged from the tree line, their pristine paint jobs and chrome trim looking absurdly out of place against the wild backdrop of forest and stone. Bo continued splitting wood as the vehicles parked near his truck, maintaining the steady rhythm he'd perfected over decades of preparing for mountain winters. The physical work helped calm his mind, and he wanted to appear unthreatened by whatever these city folks had come to discuss. 4 men emerged from the SUVs, all wearing suits that probably cost more than Beau's truck. Their leader was a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of confidence that came from never hearing the word no. He approached the porch with his hand extended, his smile as polished as his leather shoes. "Mr. Granger, I'm Richard Hartman, president of Hartman Industries. I was hoping we could have a conversation about your recent property acquisition." Beau set down his axe and accepted the handshake, noting that Hartman's grip was firm, but his hands were soft. A man who'd built his strength in boardrooms rather than wilderness. "Conversation about what exactly?" "About an opportunity that could benefit us both," Hartman replied smoothly. "My company has been interested in this particular tract of land for some time. We're prepared to make you an offer that would set you up comfortably for the rest of your retirement." The other 3 men had spread out casually, but Beau recognized the positioning. They were boxing him in, controlling his escape routes without making it obvious. Professional intimidation disguised as friendly business discussion. "Property's not for sale," Beau said simply. "Just bought it." Hartman's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "I understand your attachment to the place, but perhaps you don't fully appreciate what you're sitting on here. Our geological surveys indicate significant mineral deposits beneath this land. Copper, silver, possibly some rare earth elements that are becoming increasingly valuable." Beau leaned against the porch railing, projecting the casual attitude of a man who wasn't particularly interested in money. "That's so. Well, I reckon those minerals have been there for millions of years. Figure they can wait a while longer." "Mr. Granger, I don't think you understand the situation," Hartman said, his tone growing less friendly. "This land has been tied up in legal complications for decades. The previous owner, Walter Quincy, was an obstacle to legitimate development. Now that he's gone, we have an opportunity to resolve this matter amicably." "What kind of legal complications?" Beau asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Hartman pulled a folder from his briefcase and handed it to Beau. Inside were copies of mining claims, survey reports, and legal documents that appeared to challenge the validity of Beau's deed. The paperwork was dense and intimidating, clearly designed to overwhelm someone without legal expertise. The mineral rights to this property were legally separated from the surface rights in 1962, Hartman explained. "My company acquired those mineral rights through proper legal channels. What you own is essentially the top 40 feet of dirt and the right to build a cabin. Everything beneath that belongs to us." Beau studied the documents carefully, using the time to think. The papers looked official, but he'd learned enough about Hartman Industries from his courthouse research to know they weren't above creating legal fiction when it suited their purposes. David Morrison's death had been awfully convenient for their mining ambitions. "Funny thing," Beau said finally. "When I was at the courthouse yesterday, the clerk mentioned that your company's been trying to get hold of this land for 30 years. Seems like if you really owned the mineral rights, you'd have been mining here long ago." Hartman's smile became strained. There were environmental concerns that needed to be addressed, permitting issues that took time to resolve. But those obstacles have been cleared away now. We're ready to begin development immediately, and if I'm not interested in selling... The temperature seemed to drop several degrees as Hartman's facade of friendliness cracked. "Mr. Granger, I'm trying to be reasonable here. The previous owner was uncooperative, and that created unnecessary complications for everyone involved. Accidents happen in these mountains. Hunting mishaps, equipment failures, getting lost in the wilderness and never finding your way home. It would be unfortunate if history repeated itself." Beau felt a familiar calm settle over him, the same feeling he'd experienced when facing dangerous animals in the wild. Predators respected strength and punished weakness, and Hartman was definitely a predator. "That sounds almost like a threat. Just pointing out the realities of mountain living," Hartman replied. "Dangerous place for a man your age to be living alone. Anything could happen." Bo nodded thoughtfully, then walked to the edge of the porch where his rifle leaned against the cabin wall. He picked it up casually, checking the action with the practiced movements of someone who'd carried weapons his entire adult life. "You're absolutely right about the dangers. That's why I always keep this handy. Mountain lions, bears, wolves never know what kind of predator might wander onto a man's property." The three other men tensed, their hands moving inside their jackets, but Hartman held up a restraining gesture. He was smart enough to recognize that Bo wasn't some helpless old hermit who could be easily intimidated. "I can see you need time to consider our offer," Hartman said, his tone carefully neutral. "But don't take too long, Mr. Granger. Market conditions can change quickly, and opportunities like this don't last forever." The men returned to their vehicles without further conversation, but Bo noticed that one of them took several photographs of the cabin and property before they drove away, planning for future visits most likely, or documenting the scene for whatever they had planned next. Bo waited until the sound of their engines faded completely before going back inside. He pulled out the surveyor's map he'd found among Walter's papers, studying it more carefully now that he understood what Hartman Industries was really after. The mineral deposits were extensive and valuable, but the map showed something else that explained Walter's fierce protection of the land. Hidden among the technical markings were handwritten notes in faded ink, documenting not just mineral locations, but the sites where suspicious accidents had occurred over the years. David Morrison's hunting mishap was marked with a red X, along with dates and locations of 3 other deaths that had cleared the way for Hartman's expansion. Of their mining claims, Walter Quincy hadn't just been protecting land, he'd been collecting evidence of murder. The old hermit had spent 30 years documenting Hartman Industries' crimes, waiting for the right moment to expose them. His death had interrupted that plan, but he'd arranged for the evidence to find its way to someone who might be willing to finish what he'd started. Bo folded the map carefully and placed it back in the trunk alongside his son's military records and Violet's journal. 3 generations of the Morrison family had been destroyed by Hartman Industries' greed, but the 4th generation was about to fight back through the father who'd failed them all. The war for the Morrison land was about to begin in earnest, and Bo finally had something worth dying for. 3 days after Hartman's visit, Bo made a discovery that changed everything he thought he knew about his situation. He'd been methodically searching the cabin for additional evidence Walter might have hidden, checking every possible hiding place with the thoroughness of a man who understood that his life might depend on finding the right clues. Behind the stone fireplace, he discovered a loose rock that concealed a small metal box. Inside was a key attached to a tag bearing an address in Pine Ridge and the name Storage Unit 47. The address led Bo to a self-storage facility on the outskirts of town, a collection of corrugated metal buildings that housed the overflow of people's lives. Unit 47 was larger than Bo had expected, filled with file cabinets, boxes of documents, and something that made his heart nearly stop: a small desk where someone had been working recently. The dust patterns indicated regular use, and the coffee cup sitting beside a stack of papers was only a few days old. Bo approached the desk with growing bewilderment, examining the documents spread across its surface. They were organized with military precision: financial records tracking Hartman Industries' activities, newspaper clippings about suspicious accidents, legal filings that challenged the company's mineral rights claims. But what stopped Bo cold was the signature on a handwritten note at the bottom of the pile. The note was dated just 1 week ago. "If you're reading this, then my plan worked, and you found your way here. I've been waiting 40 years for this moment, though I never imagined it would happen quite this way. We have so much to discuss and so little time to do it in. Meet me at Murphy's Diner tomorrow at 6 p.m. Come alone, and be careful. They're watching everything now. All my love, VV Violet," but that was impossible. The courthouse clerk had told him Violet was dead, killed by cancer, several years earlier. Bo read the note again, his hands trembling as he tried to process what it meant. The handwriting was older, shakier than in the journal entries from the 1980s, but it was unmistakably the same elegant script he'd fallen in love with 40 years ago. Bo drove to Murphy's Diner in a daze, arriving 30 minutes early and positioning himself where he could watch both the entrance and the parking lot. The restaurant was a typical small-town establishment, red vinyl booths, a counter with spinning stools, and the kind of home-style cooking that reminded customers of their mothers. Bo ordered coffee and tried to prepare himself for what might be an elaborate hoax or the shock of seeing a woman he'd thought was lost forever. She walked in at exactly 6 o'clock, and despite 40 years of separation, Bo recognized her immediately. Violet Morrison was now a woman in her late 60s, her dark hair silver and her face lined with the accumulated weight of decades. But her eyes still held the intelligence and warmth that had captured his heart when they were both young. She spotted him in his corner booth and approached with the careful gait of someone who'd learned to move quietly through a world that held dangers. When she slid into the seat across from him, Bo noticed she kept her back to the wall and her eyes on the diner's entrance, habits of someone who'd spent years looking over her shoulder. "Hello, Bo," she said softly. "You look good. Mountain Living agrees with you. Violet," her name came out as barely a whisper. "I thought you were dead. The clerk at the courthouse said that I died of cancer 3 years ago. Yes, I know what the official records say." Violet's smile was sad but determined. "Sometimes death is the only way to stay alive long enough to see justice done." Bo struggled to find words adequate to the moment. 40 years of regret and imagined conversations collapsed into the simple reality of her presence across the table. "How? Why?" "Because Richard Hartman doesn't give up easily, and he doesn't leave loose ends." Violet wrapped her hands around her coffee cup as if drawing warmth from it. "After my father was killed, I knew Thomas and I would never be safe as long as we stayed in Colorado. But I also knew that running away meant abandoning any hope of making Hartman pay for what he'd done." She reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph. Thomas, in his army uniform, standing beside a woman Bo didn't recognize. "I remarried when Thomas was 12. A good man named James Patterson, who adopted Thomas and gave us new identities. We moved to Wyoming, lived quietly, and Thomas grew up believing his grandfather died in a genuine hunting accident. But you knew better. I suspected, but I couldn't prove anything. Not until Walter Quincy contacted me 15 years ago." Violet's eyes hardened with memory. Walter had been investigating my father's death on his own, collecting evidence piece by piece. He'd figured out that Hartman Industries had been systematically eliminating anyone who stood in the way of their mining operation. Bo leaned forward, trying to understand the scope of what she was telling him. "Walter knew about Thomas?" "About me?" Walter was thorough in his research. "He discovered that Thomas was your son, that you'd never known about him. When Thomas was killed in Afghanistan, Walter contacted me with a proposal." Violet's voice grew thick with emotion. "He wanted to create a trap that would expose Hartman's crimes and ensure justice for all the people they'd murdered over the years. The cabin, the journal, you arranged all of it. Walter did most of the work. He researched your whereabouts, tracked your movements, and waited for the right moment to put the property up for sale where you'd find it. The journal, the documents, even the wooden horse. We planted everything to tell the story in the right order, to make sure you'd understand what was at stake." Bo felt overwhelmed by the complexity of the deception. "But why me? Why not go to the police, the FBI?" Violet's laugh held no humor. "Hartman Industries has been buying judges and sheriff's deputies for 30 years. Half the law enforcement in this county is on their payroll. We needed someone outside their influence, someone with the skills to survive in the mountains and the motivation to see this through to the end. And you thought I was that person? After what I did to you? You're Thomas's father," Violet said simply. "Whatever mistakes you made in the past, you gave that boy the wilderness instincts that kept him alive through multiple combat deployments. I watched you fall in love with these mountains 40 years ago, saw how fiercely you protected the places you cared about. I was betting that you'd feel the same way about protecting your son's memory. Bo stared at her across the table, seeing echoes of the young woman he'd loved in the determined face of the widow who'd spent decades planning revenge. What exactly are you asking me to do? Help me finish what Walter started. Hartman is getting desperate. Your refusal to sell has them scrambling to find another way to claim the mineral rights. They're planning something big, something that will eliminate the problem permanently. But if we can get them to expose themselves, to admit what they've done, we can finally bring them to justice. How do we do that? Violet reached into her purse again and pulled out a small digital recorder. Walter spent 15 years gathering evidence, but he could never get Hartman to confess to the murders. The statute of limitations has run out on most of their crimes, but murder never expires. If we can get Richard Hartman to admit what he did to my father, to the others, we can destroy him. Bo studied her face, seeing the steel beneath the gentleness that had always defined her character. This is dangerous. If they discover you're alive, then I'll really be dead this time, and Thomas's sacrifice will have been for nothing. Violet's eyes met his with unwavering determination. I've spent 20 years preparing for this moment, Bo. I'm not backing down now. The question is whether you're finally ready to fight for something that matters. Bo thought about his son's letter, about Thomas's dream of reclaiming the Morrison land and protecting it for future generations. He thought about David Morrison, gunned down in the mountains he'd loved. He thought about Walter Quincy, spending 30 years of his life collecting evidence that might finally bring justice to the people who'd destroyed so many families. What do you need me to do? The plan Violet and Walter had developed was both elegant and dangerous. Over the next 3 days, Bo would make it appear that he was weakening in his resolve to keep the property. He'd visit the bank, ostensibly to inquire about loans against the land's value. He'd meet with a real estate agent, asking questions about market prices and development potential. Most importantly, he'd let word slip that he might be willing to negotiate with Hartman Industries after all. The key is making them believe they've won. Violet explained as they sat in her small apartment above Pine Ridge's only bookstore. She'd been living there for 3 years under the name Victoria Patterson, working as the store's manager and keeping a low profile while Walter gathered the evidence they needed. Hartman's arrogance is his weakness. If he thinks you're just another old man who can be bought or intimidated, he'll get careless. Bo studied the box of evidence that Violet and Walter had accumulated over 15 years of patient investigation. Financial records showing suspicious land acquisitions, medical examiner reports that raised questions about accidental deaths, and most damning of all, a series of recorded phone conversations where Hartman's subordinates discussed removing obstacles to their mining operations. How did Walter get these recordings? Bo asked, holding up a transcript of a conversation between 2 Hartman executives. He was more than just a hermit living in the mountains, Violet replied. Walter Quincy was a retired FBI agent who'd worked organized crime cases for 20 years before he moved to Colorado. He knew how to conduct surveillance, how to gather evidence that would stand up in court, and how to stay alive while doing it. That explained the sophistication of Walter's operation, the careful way he'd preserved evidence and planned for contingencies. But it also raised questions about how an experienced federal agent had ended up dead in his cabin, apparently from natural causes. Walter's death, Bo said carefully. Was it really his heart? Violet's expression grew grim. The autopsy showed a massive coronary, no signs of foul play. But Walter was in excellent health for a man his age, and his doctor had cleared him for full activity just months before. Hartman Industries has access to methods that don't leave obvious traces. You think they killed him? I think Walter got too close to something that scared them, and they decided he was too dangerous to leave alive. But they made a mistake. They didn't know about our partnership, didn't realize that everything Walter had discovered would find its way to someone willing to continue his work. Bo spent the afternoon reviewing surveillance, photos that Walter had taken of Hartman Industries personnel over the years. The faces were mostly unfamiliar, but one photo made him pause. A younger Richard Hartman shaking hands with a man in a sheriff's uniform outside the Pine Ridge Courthouse in 1985, just weeks before David Morrison's death, Sheriff. Duncan retired years ago, Violet explained, noticing Bo's interest in the photograph. But his successor, Sheriff Bradley, has been even more cooperative with Hartman's operations. Half the deputies on the force owe their jobs to recommendations from company executives, so we can't count on local law enforcement. Worse than that, they're actively working against us. Walter documented at least 3 occasions when deputies leaked information about his investigation to Hartman's people. That's why we had to be so careful about the timing, why everything had to appear coincidental rather than planned. The weight of what they were attempting began to settle on Bo's shoulders. They were essentially conducting a counterintelligence operation against a company with unlimited resources and law enforcement connections, armed with nothing but evidence that might not be admissible in court and a plan that required perfect execution to avoid getting them both killed. There's something else you need to know, Violet said quietly. About Thomas, about how he really died. Bo looked up from the documents, sensing that another revelation was coming that would reshape his understanding of recent events. The official story about Afghanistan is true. Thomas was killed trying to rescue wounded soldiers. But what the army didn't know was that Thomas had been investigating Hartman Industries on his own. He'd learned about his grandfather's death, figured out that it wasn't an accident, and he was planning to do something about it when he came home from deployment. Violet pulled out a letter written in Thomas's hand, dated just weeks before his death. He wrote to me about his suspicions, said he'd been making inquiries through military intelligence channels about corporate crime in Colorado. Thomas had access to resources that Walter and I didn't. Federal databases, surveillance technology, connections with law enforcement agencies that weren't corrupted by Hartman's influence. Bo read his son's letter with growing amazement and pride. Thomas had inherited more than just outdoor skills from his father. He'd developed the same stubborn determination to see justice done, regardless of personal cost. The young soldier had been planning his own investigation into the company that had destroyed his family. Do you think Hartman knew about Thomas's plans? I think they have informants everywhere, including inside the military, Violet replied. Thomas's unit was ambushed during what should have been a routine patrol. Intelligence later suggested that someone had leaked their position to enemy forces. Thomas died a hero, but he might have been betrayed by the same people he was planning to expose. The possibility that his son had been murdered because of his determination to avenge his grandfather's death hit Bo like a physical blow. 3 generations of Morrison men had been destroyed by Hartman Industries' greed, and now it fell to Bo, the one who'd run away from responsibility 40 years earlier, to finish what they'd started. The meeting with Hartman, Bo said, forcing himself to focus on the immediate task. How do we make sure he incriminates himself? Violet showed him the recording equipment Walter had assembled, miniature microphones, digital recorders, and transmission devices that could broadcast conversations to a secure location. You'll be wearing 3 separate recording systems, each with its own backup power supply. Even if they discover one device, the others should capture everything. And if they decide to kill me instead of negotiating, then you make sure the recording devices survive, even if you don't. Violet's voice was steady, but Bo could see the pain in her eyes. I know what I'm asking of you, Bo. I know the risks. But this is our only chance to get justice for Thomas, for my father, for all the others who died because of Hartman's greed. They spent the evening rehearsing different scenarios, anticipating how Hartman might react to various provocations. The plan required Bo to be just cooperative enough to keep Hartman talking, but resistant enough to force him into making threats that would reveal his past crimes. It was a delicate balance that could easily tip toward disaster if Bo pushed too hard or revealed that he knew more than he should. There's one more thing, Violet said, as Bo prepared to leave for the cabin. If this goes wrong, If something happens to both of us, there's a safety deposit box at the Pine Ridge Bank under the name Victoria Patterson. Everything we've gathered is duplicated there, along with instructions for getting it to federal authorities who aren't in Hartman's pocket." Bo nodded, understanding that she was giving him information that could ensure their work would survive, even if they didn't. And if it goes right, if we get what we need to destroy Hartman, then maybe Thomas can finally rest in peace, knowing that his family's land will be protected and the people who killed his grandfather will face justice. Violet walked him to the door, her hand briefly touching his arm. "And maybe we can figure out what comes next for two old people who've spent too many years living with regret." The touch of her hand brought back memories of the young woman he'd loved and abandoned, but it also reminded him of the strength she'd developed during their decades apart. Tomorrow would determine whether their elaborate plan succeeded or whether they'd both join the list of people who'd underestimated Richard Hartman's ruthlessness. Bo drove back to the cabin through mountain darkness, his truck's headlights cutting through forests that held 40 years of secrets. Somewhere in those trees, David Morrison had died defending his family's land. Somewhere beyond those peaks, Thomas had grown into the kind of man his father should have been. And tomorrow, in a confrontation that had been building for decades, Bo would finally have the chance to honor their memory by finishing the fight they'd started. The wooden horse sat on Walter's desk when Bo entered the cabin, a reminder of the child he'd never known and the man that child had become. Bo picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in his weathered hands, and made a silent promise to the son he'd failed in life, but wouldn't fail in death. Tomorrow, the reckoning would begin. The morning of the confrontation dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline mountain air that made everything seem sharp and immediate. Bo had called Hartman the previous evening, using the business card the executive had left behind, and arranged a meeting at the cabin for 10 o'clock. He'd played his role perfectly, a tired old man finally ready to listen to reason, worn down by isolation and the reality of fighting a company with unlimited resources. Bo spent the early hours preparing the cabin for what might be his final performance. The recording devices Violet had given him were concealed throughout the main room, one behind the stone fireplace, another inside Walter's old desk, and a third attached to the underside of the kitchen table. Each device was voice-activated and designed to run for hours on battery power, ensuring that every word of the coming conversation would be preserved. The personal recorder he wore was the most sophisticated, a device no larger than a shirt button that transmitted simultaneously to the hidden units and to a receiver Violet would monitor from her position a mile away in the forest. If something went wrong, if Hartman's people discovered the surveillance equipment, at least one recording would survive to tell the story. Bo dressed carefully in his best flannel shirt and jeans, wanting to project the image of a simple mountain man who'd finally realized he was out of his depth. The pistol he'd carried for 40 years of wilderness living was holstered beneath his jacket, though he hoped the situation wouldn't escalate to violence. His goal was confession, not confrontation. At exactly 10 o'clock, the black SUVs appeared on the mountain road, their engines echoing off the canyon walls as they climbed toward the cabin. This time, Hartman had brought additional personnel, 6 men instead of 3, all with the hard look of people accustomed to violence. Bo watched from the window as they positioned themselves around the clearing, controlling access routes with military precision. Hartman himself looked confident as he approached the porch, his expensive suit immaculate despite the rough journey up the mountain. He carried a leather briefcase that presumably contained either documents or money, the tools of his trade in acquiring property from reluctant sellers. "Mr. Granger," Hartman said warmly, extending his hand as if they were old friends meeting for a social visit. "I'm pleased you decided to reconsider our offer. I think you'll find we're prepared to be very generous." Bo invited him inside, playing the part of a gracious host despite the armed men surrounding his property. "Coffee? It's a cold morning and you've had a long drive. That would be excellent." Thank you. Hartman settled into Walter's recliner, his eyes scanning the cabin's interior with the practiced assessment of someone evaluating an acquisition. I have to say, you've done wonders with this place. Walter never kept it nearly so tidy. You knew Walter? Bo asked casually, pouring coffee from the pot he'd prepared. Oh yes, we had many conversations over the years. Stubborn old man, but I respected his dedication to this land. Unfortunately, he never understood the larger economic picture, the benefits that responsible development could bring to the entire region. Bo handed Hartman his coffee and sat across from him, noting that the executive's relaxed demeanor couldn't quite hide the tension in his shoulders. The man was confident but not entirely comfortable, suggesting he was prepared for the meeting to go badly if necessary. I've been thinking about what you said, Bo began, following the script he and Violet had rehearsed, about the mineral rights, about the legal complications. Maybe I was being stubborn, trying to hold on to something that was never really mine to keep. Hartman's smile widened. That's a very mature perspective, Mr. Granger. The truth is, this land is sitting on a fortune in mineral deposits, copper, silver, even some rare earth elements that are essential for modern technology. Development here could bring jobs to the region, tax revenue to the county, and prosperity to everyone involved. But what about the environmental concerns? These mountains have been pristine for thousands of years. Modern mining techniques are far more environmentally responsible than people realize, Hartman replied smoothly. We're not talking about strip mining or anything destructive. Our operations would be surgical, precise, designed to extract maximum value while minimizing surface impact. Bo nodded thoughtfully, taking a sip of his coffee. I suppose that makes sense. Still, it's hard to let go of a place you've grown attached to. Walter must have felt the same way. Walter was living in the past, Hartman said, and for the first time, his voice carried an edge of irritation. He couldn't see beyond his own selfish attachment to a piece of land that could benefit thousands of people. His obstinacy cost everyone, including himself. Cost him how? Hartman paused, seeming to realize he'd said more than he intended. But his arrogance overcame his caution, and he leaned forward with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages. Walter Quincy thought he was smarter than he actually was, thought he could gather evidence, build some kind of case against my company. What he didn't understand was that men like him, idealistic, naive men who believe in justice and fair play, always lose to men like me who understand that the world runs on power and money. The admission hung in the air between them, and Bo felt his pulse quicken. Hartman was already revealing more than he should, his ego driving him to explain his superiority over a dead opponent who could no longer threaten him. Evidence of what? Bo asked innocently. Hartman's expression shifted as he realized he'd walked into dangerous territory. But his need to demonstrate his superiority over the simple mountain man sitting across from him proved stronger than his caution. Walter thought he could prove that my company had been involved in certain unfortunate incidents over the years. Accidents that cleared the way for our legitimate business operations. Hartman's voice grew colder, more calculating. What he didn't understand was that sometimes progress requires difficult decisions. Sometimes obstacles need to be removed for the greater good. Bo felt his hands tighten on his coffee cup, fighting to maintain his calm facade, as Hartman essentially admitted to murder. Obstacles like David Morrison? The name hit Hartman like a slap. His eyes narrowed as he studied Bo's face, searching for signs that this conversation wasn't as innocent as it appeared. You've been doing research, Mr. Granger. That's interesting. Man buys property. He likes to know its history, Bo replied evenly. Morrison family owned this land for generations before they sold to Walter. Heard the old man died in a hunting accident. David Morrison was a stubborn fool who couldn't see reason, Hartman said, his mask of civility finally slipping away. He had lawyers, filed injunctions, tied up our development plans for months with frivolous lawsuits. His death was convenient for everyone involved. Convenient. Bo repeated the word slowly, letting its implications hang in the air. That's an interesting way to describe a man getting shot in the woods. Hartman stood abruptly, pacing to the window, where he could see his security team positioned around the clearing. I think this conversation has gone far enough, Mr. Granger. Are you interested in selling your property, or are you planning to follow in Walter Quincy's footsteps? Depends on what happened to Walter, Bo said, remaining seated despite the obvious threat in Hartman's tone. Old man dies alone in his cabin. Heart attack, they said. But Walter was in good health, according to his doctor. Walter Quincy was playing a dangerous game, Hartman replied, turning back to face Bo. He thought he could expose my company, destroy everything I'd built over 30 years. He forgot that men like him, idealists who believe in justice, are easily replaced, while men like me are irreplaceable. The admission was everything Violet needed, but Bo pushed further, knowing this might be their only chance to get the whole truth on record. And Thomas Morrison, David's grandson, did he get too close to the truth as well? Hartman's face went white with shock. How do you know that name? Thomas was a soldier, decorated war hero who died in Afghanistan. But word is he'd been asking questions about his grandfather's death, making inquiries through military intelligence channels. Funny how his unit got ambushed during what should have been a routine patrol. You're fishing, Hartman said, but his voice lacked conviction. Thomas Morrison died fighting terrorists, nothing more. Maybe, or maybe someone leaked his unit's position to enemy forces, made sure he wouldn't come home to continue his investigation. Bo stood slowly, his hand moving casually toward the gun beneath his jacket. Amazing how far your reach extends, Richard. Local sheriffs, federal officials, even military intelligence. How many people have you killed over the years? Hartman's composure finally cracked completely. You're wearing a wire. This whole conversation has been a setup. He pulled a pistol from his briefcase, pointing it at Bo's chest. Very clever, Mr. Granger, but not clever enough. Maybe not, Bo agreed, his own weapon clearing its holster with the speed of decades of practice. But smart enough to know that you'd rather confess than keep your mouth shut. The two men faced each other across Walter's living room, weapons drawn and fingers on triggers. Outside, Bo could hear Hartman's security team responding to their boss's raised voice. Boots crunching on gravel as they moved toward the cabin. Even if you've recorded this conversation, it won't matter, Hartman said. Accidents happen in these mountains all the time. You'll disappear just like Walter did, just like anyone else who gets in my way. Difference is, Walter was alone, Bo replied. I've got backup you don't know about. What backup? You're a 70-year-old hermit with no family, no connections. Who's going to miss you when you're gone? Bo smiled grimly. Someone who's been waiting 40 years for this moment. Someone who knows exactly who you are and what you've done. The cabin door burst open as Hartman's men stormed inside, weapons drawn and ready for violence. But instead of finding a helpless old man, they discovered two armed opponents locked in a standoff that could explode into gunfire at any moment. Boss, one of the security men called uncertainly. Kill him, Hartman ordered. Kill him and burn this place down. Make it look like an accident. But before anyone could fire, the crack of a rifle echoed from the forest outside. One of Hartman's men dropped to the ground, clutching his shoulder and screaming in pain. A second shot shattered the cabin's front window, sending glass shards across the room as everyone dove for cover. This is the FBI, a voice shouted from the tree line. Drop your weapons and come out with your hands visible. Violet had kept one final secret from Bo. Walter's evidence had already reached federal authorities who weren't corrupted by Hartman's influence. The confrontation at the cabin was the trap they'd needed to catch Hartman in the act of threatening a witness. The reckoning had finally arrived. 6 months later, Bo stood on the restored porch of the Morrison cabin, watching the sunrise paint the Rocky Mountain peaks in shades of gold and rose. The federal investigation had taken 3 months to complete, resulting in indictments for Richard Hartman and 14 associates on charges ranging from murder to racketeering. The recorded confession at the cabin had provided the cornerstone evidence that brought down an empire built on 4 decades of corruption and violence. Violet emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. her silver hair catching the morning light as she settled into the chair beside him. She'd officially returned from the dead after the FBI arrests, resuming her real identity and helping prosecutors build their case against Hartman Industries. The company had been dissolved, its assets seized to pay restitution to the families of its victims. "The lawyer called yesterday," Violet said, handing Bo his coffee. "The Morrison Family Trust is officially established. The land will be protected in perpetuity, just like Thomas wanted." Bo nodded, looking out over the 40 acres that now belonged to a conservation trust bearing his son's name. Thomas Walter Morrison had never lived to see his grandfather's land reclaimed, but his dream of protecting the mountain wilderness for future generations had finally been realized. The cabin itself had been carefully restored using photographs from the Morrison family's time there. The rooms that had once been choked with Walter's accumulated possessions now held furniture and memories that honored 3 generations of the family that had called this place home. In the living room, a display case held Thomas's military decorations alongside his grandfather's hunting rifles and his grandmother's quilts. "Any regrets?" Bo asked, settling back in his chair with the contentment of a man who'd finally found his place in the world. "About exposing Hartman?" "None whatsoever." Violet's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd seen justice done after decades of waiting. "About the 40 years we lost?" Every single day, they talked extensively about those lost decades, the choices that had driven them apart, the different paths their lives had taken, the weight of regret that both of them carried. Bo had apologized for his abandonment, for the cowardice that had cost them both so much. Violet had forgiven him, understanding that the young man who'd run away in fear was not the same person who'd stayed to fight for their son's memory. "Thomas would have liked knowing you," Violet said quietly. "He had your stubbornness, your sense of justice, and your ability to disappear into the wilderness when the world got too complicated." Bo pulled out the wooden horse he now carried everywhere, its familiar weight a constant reminder of the son he'd never known. "I keep thinking about all the things I missed. First words, first steps, teaching him to track animals and read weather signs. He learned those things anyway," Violet replied. "The mountains taught him what his father couldn't. Maybe that's how it was supposed to happen." A truck rumbled up the mountain road, announcing the arrival of their weekly visitor. Dr. Sarah Chen climbed out of her vehicle, carrying the medical bag that had become a familiar sight around the cabin. The young physician had volunteered to provide health care for the area's scattered residents, viewing the mountain practice as a way to serve communities that larger medical systems ignored. "How are we feeling today?" Dr. Chen asked as she climbed the porch steps. She'd been monitoring Violet's recovery from the stress and health problems that had accumulated during her years of hiding and planning revenge. "Strong," Violet replied, and Bo could see that it was true. The woman who'd spent 3 years pretending to be dead had returned to life with renewed purpose and energy, ready to start the next chapter. That next chapter included plans that both honored the past and looked toward the future. The Thomas Morrison Foundation would provide outdoor education programs for disadvantaged youth, teaching wilderness skills and environmental stewardship in the mountains Thomas had loved. Violet would oversee the educational aspects while Bo handled the practical instruction, sharing knowledge accumulated over 7 decades of mountain living. "The first group of students arrives next month," Dr. Chen said as she finished her examination of Violet's blood pressure and heart rate. 12 kids from Denver, most of whom have never been outside the city. They're going to learn more in 2 weeks here than they would in a year of traditional schooling. Bo smiled at the thought of young people discovering the same connection to the wilderness that had shaped his own life. Unlike his younger self, however, these children would learn that love of the outdoors could coexist with responsibility to family and community. Thomas's legacy would ensure that future generations understood both the freedom and the obligations that came with caring for wild places. As Dr. Chen drove away, Bo and Violet returned to their comfortable silence. watching the sun climb higher above the peaks that had witnessed so much history. David Morrison's death had been avenged, Thomas's dream realized, and Walter Quincy's patient investigation vindicated. The cycle of violence that had dominated this land for 30 years was finally broken. Do you think he would approve? Violet asked, nodding toward the display case visible through the cabin's window. Thomas, I mean. Do you think he'd be happy with what we've accomplished? Bo considered the question carefully, thinking about the young soldier whose courage had inspired everything that followed. I think he'd be proud that his family's land will be protected forever. And I think he'd be amazed that his parents finally found their way back to each other. Violet reached over and took his weathered hand in hers, their fingers intertwining with the ease of people who'd learned that love could survive decades of separation and regret. They were both old now, their time together limited by the years they'd lost. But the mountain silence held the promise of whatever days remained, and the wooden horse on the table between them bore witness to the redemption that made those days precious. In the distance, an eagle soared above the peaks where Thomas Morrison's spirit would forever ride the mountain winds, watching over the land he'd died to protect.